So moving on to this second part, the formula that we're going to use is exactly the same, but remembering that in the first lesson everything was of the form 1 plus. Okay, so we've seen the formula for this. The formula only allows us to use 1 plus x to the power of n, and therefore we need to just have a think about what we're going to do if we have a value instead of 1 leading that bracket. So what we do is we factorise it out. When we factorise it out, it looks like this. We've got the power of n acting on both of these, so this actually becomes a to the power of n. Now if we just take a moment to think about a simple example maybe. So if I just look at something like 2 plus x squared, let's keep it basic because we know how this expands. So we would, when we're expanding this out, because remember if we were doing it the other way, if we're not using binomial and we're writing it this way, what we get is that times that first. So that would be 2 squared, and then I end up with 4x plus x squared. It's that 2 squared that I am interested in here. Okay, it isn't just 2, so I haven't ended up with 2, I've ended up with the 2 squared in terms of the leading term. Now if we factorise out that 2 from there, so what we would get when we factorise it out is we get 2 squared. 2 divided by 2 is 1, factorising just means divide, remember, and then we get x over 2 here. So that's what we would be expanding. So I've got 2 squared at the front, we get 1 plus x, because when I do that and then add them together, so 1 times x over 2, add 1 times x over 2 just gives me x, and then I've got plus x squared over 4. That 2 squared, when it multiplies in, it will give us this. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that number there is not 2. If I factorise it out, whatever power I've got on that bracket needs to act upon that value there. So we're going to look at these two examples here. Notice that the question is asking me to go as far as x squared, and I'm also asked for the validity of the expansion. So we're looking at these two questions here. Neither of them have a 1 leading the bracket. So the first one, there's the formula. It's the same as what's in the formula book. We're not changing that from the first lesson. So the first one is this. That 2 needs to be factorised out of the bracket, and when I factorise it out, that minus 3 as the power acts on it. Okay. When I factorise, all I'm doing is dividing both of those terms. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, and then x divided by 2 is the other term, and then they're both raised to the power of minus 3. Okay, so have a look at that. This expansion now is exactly the same as what we were doing in the last lesson, so you can apply this formula to this. So convince yourself that that's the case and have a go at expanding this out. So maybe just pause the video and have a look at that. Moving on, this is the expansion you should have got. So look out for all the brackets. There's a lot of brackets going on here. So I've got brackets around the minus 3. That's so that I can watch those minus signs. I've put a bracket around the x over 2. Remember, when we're substituting in for this x, we put whatever we've got here, we substitute that into the formula. At this point, that squared would make that x squared, and it would make that 4. Okay, so that 2 is acting on both the numerator and denominator of that term there. So I've then got big brackets around the whole thing, which allows me to put the 2 to the minus 3 at the front, and we would advise you to always put that there. Because the common mistakes that we see is that it's either just completely forgotten after this point, because you go off and expand this and then forget to put it back in, or it only expands to that first term. So we'd get 1 over 8 here, but forget to multiply everything. You know how brackets work, you know how to expand them. If you put the brackets in, you've more of a chance of getting it right. Next step, simplify down the square brackets, and then take the 1 over 8 into the square brackets to get your 3 terms. So we've just gone up as far as x squared. Remember, this expansion would be infinite. We know that this is valid if we're thinking about the original equation. This is valid for the modulus of x less than 1, which means between minus 1 and 1. The modulus of x less than 1. I've substituted x over 2 for x. in this expansion, so we would do the same with the validity. So it's the modulus of x over 2, whatever is sat in that position goes inside the modulus, and then to simplify it I would just multiply through by 2. So in this question we would be able to take anything between -2 and 2 in terms of doing this expansion. Remembering what we learned in the last lesson, that the things closest to 0 are always going to give us the best approximation. Moving on to the next question. So we have the same formula, and then we know that square root means power of a half. So this time I'm taking that 9 out. I'm going to factorise the 9 out of the bracket, and when I factorise it out it goes 9 to the power of a half, and then open brackets, 9 divided by 9 is 1, x divided by 9 is x over 9, and that gets the power of a half. So we are looking at this expansion here. Again, pause the video, have a go at expanding it all out, and then check in to see whether you have got your answer right. So using the formula that we were using in the last lesson, square brackets around it, so I've got a half in here for the power, so that's the value of n, and then remember that minus sign there, we need to be careful with that, so that's come into this bracket here, so I've got minus x over 9. When I square it, that is going to be positive, so I would have x squared over 81. Here I've got minus x over 9. Again, minus signs being introduced to these fractions, so this can get really messy. Again, you need to write it out before you do anything with it. Next line, simplify down your square brackets and then take your 3 into the bracket. Finally, you need to write down your validity, so just have a moment, see if you can write it down, pause the video and see if you can write down your validity. We are using the x over 9 in place of x. I don't need to worry about the minus sign because we looked at in the first lesson that the minus sign would just divide through, and in this case, because I'm using modulus notation, we ignore it anyway. So we've got x over 9 is less than 1, modulus of x over 9 is less than 1, multiplying through by the 9 gives me modulus of x is less than 9.